You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Investment advice for your 401k in the Bible? Believe it or not, some people do actually think that is here in chapter 11. Now, whether or not that's what Qoheleth intended, well, you'll have to listen to the episode for that. We'll also be covering a verse used by anti-abortion groups in favor of their position, as well as some advice to party it up while you're still young. So we've got a little bit of everything this week, and we'll be coming at it from all angles. So this one is guaranteed to push some buttons. Here is Ecclesiastes 11, Uncut and Unfiltered. All these verses pretty much go together, but we're going to break it up into 2 or 3 different sections here. So I'm going to start with just the first 2 verses and see what we can get out of that. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7, and also to 8, for you know not what evil will be upon the earth. Now this is the set of verses where people look at and see investment advice. And it makes sense. I mean, just reading it in English, it kind of sounds like diversify your portfolio, right? Send out whatever you have in multiple directions and see what you get back from it. Particularly in verse 2, where he says to give a portion to 7 and also 8 because you don't know what could happen. And that is a possible interpretation. But let's look at a couple things in the wording of the verses here and then see where that leads. First, I want to point out that there is some really cool wordplay here in this first verse because the Hebrew word for waters is hamayim. And just a totally random piece of information that you don't need to know, but if you ever go on a Hebrew version of Jeopardy, I guess you'll have this useless information for you here. Hebrew has 3 different numbers when it comes to words. A word can be singular, plural, or dual. So you can have, say, a dog would be singular. Dual would be a specific way of putting the word that is only for 2. And this is only very specific words. So like dog is actually a bad example because you don't have a dual form of that word. But if you did, you would only use it for 2, and then the plural is 3 or more. There aren't a lot of words in Hebrew that are like that. Most just have singular and plural, like in English, right? Most of our words are just singular or plural. But there are a few rare instances where there's this dual number to the word where it's only 2. And waters is one of them, hamayim. So whenever you see waters in the Bible, it's usually going to be this word, hamayim. You say, well, why would it be dual? Well, we have to go all the way back now to Genesis 1, and if you haven't listened to our episodes on that, I would definitely recommend it, because we talk about how the ancient Israelites had this view, and pretty much everyone in the ancient Near East did, that you had the waters below and the waters above. So the waters below, that's the sea, that's everything water that you can see around you, but then also there were waters above what they called the firmament or the rakia, which was like this dome, I call it like a snow globe above the earth. I think that even comes from Bible Project. So that's why you have waters usually described in dual, because you have the waters below and the waters above. Interestingly enough, heavens is another one of these rare dual words in Hebrew, and they kind of rhyme because waters is hamayim and heaven is shamayim. And we talked about that in the Genesis 1 episodes as well, the different tiered ideas of heaven, the skies is what it would have meant at that point. At least I think we covered that. Pretty sure we did. The closest thing I can think of in English to the dual idea in Hebrew is where we have certain words that we have to say pair with, like a pair of pants. I wouldn't say I'm wearing pant, right? I say I'm wearing a pair of pants, even though it's singular. Or I'm wearing glasses. Well, it's only one glass, but we wouldn't say it that way, right? We say glasses, even though it's just a singular. Or scissors is another example, where you only have one scissors, but it's still plural as if it's 2. It's kind of similar, kind of different. Anyway, all of that to say that the word for waters here in this verse is hamayim, and then the word for days is hayamim. So you can hear hamayim, hayamim. We basically just switched the position of the Y and the M sound. Hamayim, hayamim. Another unique Hebraism that tends to get left out of a lot of translations is the fact that whenever you have well, I shouldn't say whenever, but a lot of instances where you have water mentioned in the Bible, you're going to have the face of the waters, is how it will literally read in Hebrew. So on top of the waters, in front of the waters, it basically just means water's there, but they tend to say on the face of the water. And that's here in this verse, cast your bread upon the face of the waters. And I was kind of surprised to see the King James leave it out because it's a very literalistic translation that tries to go word for word. But this is a case where they actually left that out, and I don't know why, because while it's not exactly great English to say cast your bread upon the face of the waters, they make other translation choices in other cases that aren't good English either, but they more closely follow the Hebrew. So that one confused me a little bit why they decided to leave that off. But the word for cast is actually a word for sending out something, and it's usually with the idea of sending something purposefully to someone else. So it's not just going to be a haphazard send this out in hopes of some random chance happening. This is actually a purposeful action. Part of the difficulty of understanding this verse is that translators don't agree on how to handle the word in the middle of the verse. It's the Hebrew word key, and it does sound like the key that you unlock a door, but it's like a conjunction. It's very versatile. It can mean because, indeed, surely, verily, but, except, when, even though, as, and context is going to determine what it means in each of those instances. Where that comes into play is whether this is saying you should cast your bread, you should send out your bread on the waters because you'll find it again, or it could be saying even if you cast your bread on the waters, you will find it again. So there's a little bit of a nuance there. It still gets at the same general idea, but there is some difference of opinion there. The most common interpretation sees these two verses as advice for charitable giving. But moving into a quote from Murphy in the Word Biblical Commentary now, some scholars actually believe it's about commerce on the sea. And he connects this to Isaiah 18:2, which mentions sending, that same word shalach that's here in this verse as cast, send ambassadors in the sea and in papyrus vessels upon the waters. And that's where you have that upon the face of the waters again that we have here in this verse. So he says in Isaiah, the reference is to traveling by sea, and here in 11:1 to commerce by sea. Accordingly, despite the risk and daring of such a course, one is counseled to take a commercial risk that has some possibility, but not certainty, of success. And he points out that the word the King James translates as you shall find it after many days could possibly have a modal nuance to it. In other words, you may find it. It doesn't have to be a promise. It could just be mentioning possibility. So he goes on, the venture at sea can be understood literally, or metaphorically for any venture. In this case, the interpretation flows naturally from the meaning of verse 1a, which involves a risk. Take a calculated risk, since there may be a good result from it. A third interpretation is also possible. Bread in the water could be a metaphor for doing something that is really senseless. The bread merely dissolves, but this action, which is counseled, can nevertheless paradoxically lead to an unexpected successful result. The reason for this action is that we are simply ignorant of the future and its possibilities. So where he's going with that third one is it's not necessarily a command saying you must send out your bread upon the waters. It could just be saying if you send out your bread on the waters, this is what could potentially happen. So even if you waste stuff, you could potentially still end up getting stuff back. And that could possibly fit with some of what Qoheleth has talked about. You know, even people who do stupid things in life sometimes seem to get rewarded for it. Personally, I don't really think that third view is what Qoheleth was getting at, and Murphy actually goes on to say that the first view about charitable giving should not be taken seriously, since he says the text says nothing about almsgiving. And he's right that it does not, but I don't think that's enough yet to completely write off that idea. So we'll come back to that in a second. Getting back to what Murphy says. He says the meaning of this passage depends on the interpretation of 11 verse 2. The structural agreement between 1 and 2 signifies that the lines must be related in meaning. So he says those who interpret verse 1 in the sense of almsgiving see here the admonition to share possessions in several, 7 or 8 ways. The second interpretation, the one about commerce on the sea, understands the division into portions as a precaution against the misfortune that could occur. The meaning is then similar to don't put all your eggs in one basket. And this cracked me up a little bit, because Murphy is a good scholar, but I don't know. This one fell a little forced to me. He says the practice followed by Jacob in Genesis 32, 8 and 9 would be a concrete example. Now, if you actually look up Genesis 32, 8 and 9, this is when Jacob is meeting up with his long-lost brother Esau for the first time in a long time. And it's true, he does divide up his entire camp into several portions, and he specifically says the idea is in case Esau wants revenge for what happened when we were younger, he'll only get part of my stuff and everything else can retreat. The problem is he was sending wives and children in each of those and was like ranking the wives and children in each category based on which ones he would be more okay with losing. So I kind of feel like after that whole instance, now granted, Esau, they reconciled, but yeah, I kind of think that this story may actually be what caused all of the sibling rivalry from the Joseph story, because I just tend to think that whichever wives and children ended up in the first couple of groups were probably not too big fans of Jacob after that. So the fact that he used that as an example of don't put all your eggs in one basket, like, yes, I mean, technically it is, but it's a very crass example to give. So that just kind of cracked me up reading that. Continuing on, he says the third interpretation, and this would be the idea he presented that it's actually a foolish thing to do, but you could potentially still get some reward because of the hevel of life. He says this third interpretation then finds verse 2 to be an antithesis to verse 1. If previously the paradox of a possible success was held out, now one is warned not to bank on taking precautions against mishap. These will do no good. The misfortune one knows not may be lurking ahead. And then he goes on to say that he actually takes that third view. As I was looking at a handful of different translations for this particular week's study, I was surprised to find several following the second option, the one about seed trading. The Good News Bible says, invest your money in foreign trade, and one of these days you'll make a profit. The NIV said, ship your grain across the sea. After many days you may receive a return. It was very similar to a few other versions there as well. And just a quick note on translations here, because I did come out of a very strict King James only background where we believe that the King James was the only version that you should use. It was the only God-inspired one, and not only were all the others bad and inaccurate, they were actually lies of the devil trying to deceive you. Now, we're going to get into some Bible translation stuff within the next year here, so I'm just going to tease that out a little bit. But it's actually really important when you're doing Bible study to reference other versions. Even if you have a preferred version, most people do. And as you can tell in this podcast, I default to using King James a lot of times because that's just what I grew up on. I had a crap ton of memory verses that I had as a kid, in Master Club and Awana Cubbies and Neighborhood Bible Time and the vacation Bible schools that we did and all this stuff. Ridiculous amounts of Bible memorization. So it's just in my head, and I went to a very conservative Bible college that used King James only as well, so when I started learning Greek and Hebrew, I learned it based on the wording of the King James in English, so my connection of those two things is kind of tied together. Regardless, it's super important that we reference other Bible versions because most of them out there are good. Most of our English Bible versions are trustworthy, reliable, accurate, scholarly, done by people who really know what they're doing. And so it helps us to get a feel for what the text is actually saying when we can see a few different angles of this. I mean, the Bible itself says that in the multitude of counselors, there is safety and wisdom, right? So we're supposed to be looking at different angles. And, when you're reading your Bible by yourself, you don't exactly have a bunch of people around you saying, oh, nope, that's a bad interpretation that you're about to take there. Like, don't go down that rabbit hole. So Bible versions kind of act like other counselors around you to say, that might not be saying what you think it says. And it gives you the opportunity to see, whoa, these versions actually have a lot of debate here. There's a lot of difference. Why might that be? And then you can sort of get into that study a little bit more deeply and say, this might be a verse that has a lot going on the back end here. There's a lot on like the Hebrew or Greek side that I might not understand, but these people who have put in the work do, and so I can see some of these textual debates and what's going on under the hood, even if I'm not a Bible scholar. And most of the time you're going to find a significant amount of agreement between the translations. But especially when you're in like the poetical books of the Old Testament, So something like Ecclesiastes, that's where you're going to find a lot of variation amongst the translations. And we're going to be bringing that out a lot this week. I touch on it occasionally in episodes when I find it useful, but I've just found a lot of variance in Bible translations in this particular chapter. So I do want to draw attention to that as we go through this week's episode. It's not something that we should be scared of. It's not, oh, these modern versions are trying to change the Bible. No, it's just the fact that when you are writing something poetic, you're going to use a lot of times more flowery dialogue, right? You might use words that aren't quite as common. You're pulling out your thesaurus. And that's what we have here in the Bible's wisdom literature, the Bible's poetry as well, which Ecclesiastes falls under. There are going to be rarer words that we weren't 100% sure what they meant in 1611 or even 100 years ago. But as scholarship continues to grow and learn, we get more writings from the ancient world where we're able to compare and see, oh, that word actually means this or that. And then as we continue to develop and these disciplines overlap, we get closer and closer to a more original understanding of the text. So even older versions like the King James still give you an overall accurate idea of the Bible. But in general, the more recent a scholarly based version is going to be, the more it's going to be closer to the original text's meaning because we've had more time to learn and develop in Bible study. So don't let these different versions scare you. It's actually a way that we can do good Bible study on a dime budget, right? This is for the person who doesn't have a Bible college education and maybe doesn't like getting into the super nerdy commentaries. What you can do is just buy a few different Bibles. And I realize Bibles can be expensive too, but you can get Bible software, or heck, you can use YouVersion. YouVersion has dozens of English Bible translations for free that you can access, and you can see the difference. You can even put a couple of them like one over the other and see multiple versions at the same time on the YouVersion app. So that's cheap, easy Bible study that tells you more about what's going on behind the scenes in the text than, honestly, a lot of common Bible commentaries you're going to find online or in a bookstore will do. All right, fair enough? Tracking? Cool? All right, getting back into verses 1 and 2 here. Brown, from the Interpretation Bible Commentary, aligns the traditional view of charitable giving with an ancient Egyptian proverb that says, "Do a good deed and throw it in the water. When it dries, you will find it." And that is from the Instruction of Anshashang, which I know we've referenced here in this series already, so that's popped up a couple times now. He also mentions the Arabic proverb, "Do good, throw your bread on the waters, and one day you will find it." So most of that sounds really similar to verse 1, but they add that "do good" part on the beginning that maybe gives us a little bit of an interpretive clue that this was in the water, no pun intended, it was in the culture of that day, and gives us a little bit of a key to understanding what it could mean. Brown goes on to say, "To be sure, it appears uncharacteristically optimistic for Qoheleth to contend that something beneficial awaits the giver, that charity leads to mutual benefit, much in contrast to the modern cynical proverb, 'No good deed goes unpunished.' Nevertheless, the reference to bread in 11.1 connotes elsewhere for the sage the means of sustenance and joy, an eminently positive theme for the sage. Keep in mind that Qoheleth is interested not so much in social graces, as more broadly in the intersection of ethics and joy. It's fitting that joy be shared in fellowship. Charity, in short, is an investment in joy. No more, no less. Repayment is the reciprocity that the good deed engenders." I'm actually going to align a little bit more closely to Brown here than I do to Murphy. And here's my thinking for it. It would not have been feasible for the average person in the ancient world to partake in maritime trading. And just think about that. The average person was living a subsistence lifestyle. They couldn't open Coinbase or Robinhood on their phone and make a bunch of investments, right? They couldn't call up their stockbroker. They couldn't even go to the shipyard and say, "Hey, I want to sponsor this much grain going here, and when you come back, I get some of the profits." The average person didn't have that kind of ability. They didn't have enough to part with for that sort of thing. Now, I will say it's also worth knowing that Qoheleth has geared his message toward those up and coming in a royal court, particularly in this last half of the book. So it is possible that he was talking to people who did have the means to do that sort of thing. But I just don't see him giving business advice that much in Ecclesiastes. Sure, there was a little bit of pragmatic business advice, I guess you could say, in the royal court about how you respond in relation to the king, which I think was chapters 7 and 9, if I remember correctly. But even then, that was more relational than business necessarily, or at least it was relationships within business. And this has nothing to do with relationships. So I don't really see him just speaking solely to business. He does speak a lot about interpersonal relationships, though. And in the previous chapter, he said that bread was for laughter. So what I think he's actually getting at here when he says cast your bread on the waters is to say share the good times. Have a meal with people you care about, and it may very likely happen that they'll invite you over for dinner. And so you definitely get some of that giving idea that when you give, you're going to get back. And some commentators will try to say that's just Qoheleth being pragmatic, right? He's just saying, well, the more you give, the more you're going to get, so you should give more so you can get more. And, that's not entirely wrong. I feel like a lot of people kind of put down giving so that you can get, but isn't that sort of the idea of community? Like, I give a part of myself to this community, so when I need something back, the community's going to be there to help me. I don't think having that little bit of selfish motive is entirely a bad thing necessarily, but I also don't think that that's wholly what Qoheleth is getting at here. Because while I do think he is a pragmatist, he's also talking about the ways to get the most out of life that you can. And so for him, these interpersonal relationships, these times of laughter and sharing of food with friends, that's central. Remember, that's part of his fourfold path to the good life. So I don't think this is just him being pragmatic and saying the more you give, the more you get. I think he's saying if you want the good life, you actually have to do this. You actually have to spend time with friends and family over good food and beverages. Because that's 3 out of his 4 aspects of a good life: eat good food, drink good drinks, hang out with people you love, and try to find a job that doesn't totally suck. So I think that's what he's tying into here. And moving into verse 2, we have yet another very Hebrew turn of phrase where he says, give a portion to 7 and also to 8. Listing one number and then the next is a common Hebraism in the Tanakh to suggest a general number of something. I thought of Proverbs where you read, these 6 things does the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. Or in the prophets, I think it might have been Amos, you have for 3 transgressions and for 4 of XYZ country, I will do such and such. So he's not actually saying you need 7 friends, maybe 8, or divide up all of your investments into 7 different groups and possibly 8, but no more. He's just saying generally diversify, because you don't know what evil will be on the earth. And that word evil is something that's shown up a lot in our study here in Ecclesiastes. We've talked about how it both does and doesn't have the moral component that we tend to think of it having. We see it only in that moral sense, but evil can also just be a general badness. So he could be saying, you don't know what misfortune could possibly happen. The Good News Bible gave the standard interpretation here. Put your investments in several places, many places, in fact, because you never know what kind of bad luck you're going to have in this world. And Brown again saw this as diversifying stewardship rather than assets. His idea then was to give to multiple charities so you can spread out your network of helping others and potentially people who could then help you when you need it. That's not bad advice at all, but I think it's worth noting that the ancient world didn't have the same oversaturation of charitable organizations that we do today. So if someone were to read what Brown said in the interpretation commentary, they might think, okay, I should give a little bit to the Salvation Army, a little bit to the Red Cross, a little bit to, this food bank in my town. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good to, spread out your giving. But that's not exactly consistent with what would have been available in the ancient world. The average person hearing this said in 400 years before Jesus wouldn't have been going, oh, okay, let me go find my local Red Cross or Salvation Army or what have you. Those organizations didn't necessarily exist. Charitable organizations, if you will, in the ancient world were more in the form of a patron willing to bankroll your work in the hopes of a profit for himself as well. So I think that's closer to what the audience Qoheleth had would have been thinking. I do really love Peterson's translation, the message here. He said, "Don't hoard your goods, spread them around, be a blessing to others. This could be your last night." That's a little bit of a somber ending there, but I think he gets at the heart of what Qoheleth is saying. Again, Message Bible gets a lot of flack, but he really came through on Ecclesiastes. I've liked what I've read in a lot of these verses. So, investment advice? Probably not intended to be, even though it is actually pretty good investment advice. And it's probably also not about giving to charitable organizations. It's probably more so just about sharing the resources that you have with as many people as you can. And part of the benefit of that is you'll have more people willing to share resources with you. Now let's look at verses 3 through 6. "If the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if the tree fall toward the south or toward the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will be. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you know not which is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so you don't know the works of God who makes all. In the morning sow your seed, and the evening withhold not your hand, for you know not whether it shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good." Now, I didn't plan this in my study. I didn't think about this in my study. But now, just reading verses 5 and 6 together, I can't help but think that Qoheleth may have had a bit of a mischievous grin on his face, since he talked about a pregnant woman, and then the very next verse talks about sowing your seed. That's a biblical metaphor that I'll just let you ponder out for a little while there. Moving back to verse 3, though. The point of his saying that if the clouds be full of rain, it's going to rain. If the tree falls, it's going to fall. The point is that those things are out of human control. You can't make it rain, and you can't determine which way a tree is going to fall. It's almost like the ancient version of if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there, except Qoheleth's version doesn't care if someone's there to hear it or not because, well, if the tree's going to fall, the tree's going to fall. Life is going to happen with or without your attempts to manipulate it. And amusingly, they are both things that we've kind of learned to control as humans. Like, we can change the weather slightly. You can think about seeding clouds for rain. You can think about chopping a tree in a particular direction to fell it a different way, or even just putting a chain around it and pulling it down. So, in a sense, these are actually things that we can control now, when these were mostly things that were fully in God's control at the time of Ecclesiastes. The human story is one long attempt to become progressively more like God, for better or for worse, and often a mixture of both. But even despite our best attempts, we don't fully control nature. Nature is still out of our control for the most part, and it even seems to retaliate against our advances. Just look at the ridiculous weather that we've had around the world in this past year here. So maybe there's still a good bit about this verse that rings true. Murphy summarized the view of another scholar with the last name Strobel, who thought that this was actually saying that you should act before the rain comes and not just wait for the right time to see if a tree is going to fall in the right direction. Just act now. That's an interesting take on it. It reminded me of one time I was at a camp, a kids' camp. I think it was in Pennsylvania. I was with a church, and we had taken some first through sixth grade students over there. And it was in the woods, and so you would have like a little hike that the campers would go on with the counselor. And as we're walking along the path, you just hear this tree creaking and cracking. And I was there with a guy who actually like worked there the whole summer. And he looked over at me, I looked at him, and we're like, should we be walking right by this right now? Probably not. And so we just had to really quick rush by and be like, all right, let's not give this the time to fall and see if it falls in the right direction. Let's just go by it right now. So that kind of reminded me of that idea. Verse 4 really gets into the idea that since you can't control so much in life, you shouldn't just wait for the perfect time. In fact, you could even translate the first half of the verse, "The one who holds his breath will not sow." That word the King James has as observeth is the word shomer in Hebrew. It's a very versatile word. It can mean to hold, to keep, to guard, to watch. It all kind of depends on the context. But regardless of which definition you go with, those are all things you can't do with wind. And the word here for wind is that word ruach, again, that we've talked about throughout this series. You can't hold on to air. You can't guard breath. You can't watch wind. Now, you can watch the effect of wind in the tree, but you don't actually see the wind itself, right? So none of these definitions are actually things that you can even do in the first place. So it's kind of a paradox. It's kind of saying, why are you even trying to do this? It's completely futile. It reminded me of what Jesus said to Nicodemus in John 3:8, where he says, the wind blows where it lists and you hear the sound, but you can't tell from where it's coming and where it's going. Even so are those born of the Spirit. That's only a few verses before the famous John 3:16. But what's so interesting that people don't realize is the word for wind and the word for spirit in that verse are the same word. Now it's in Greek, so it's going to be the word pneuma, but it's the same idea. And as I started studying this, I'm like, wow, I think Jesus may have had Ecclesiastes 11 on the brain when he was talking to Nicodemus, which was really cool. And the second part of the verse, regarding clouds, it's literally seeing clouds. So we have trying to keep wind and trying to see clouds. Well, obviously you can see clouds, but I think the idea was trying to understand the pattern of the clouds, trying to say, oh, it looks like it's going to rain, or, no, I don't think it's going to rain today. But we've all had days where it looked like it wasn't going to, and it did, and days when it looked like it would, and it didn't. So keeping ruach and seeing clouds both imply a worrisome obsession over events that are out of your control. The Good News Bible put it this way: if you wait until the wind and weather are just right, you'll never sow anything and never harvest anything. New Century Version: those who wait for perfect weather will never plant seeds. Those who look at every cloud will never harvest crops. And the Message: don't sit there watching the wind. Do your own work. Don't stare at the clouds. Get on with your life. If we tie this back to chapter 3 with the time poem, there's a time for this and a time for that. There is a right time for everything, but you don't necessarily know what that is. There is no handbook for life that says, now is the time to do this, now is not the time to do that. And the longer you wait, the greater your chances of missing that right time actually is. So what Qoheleth is trying to say here is actually really sound advice, and it's make the right time by doing it now. Now, obviously, that's not a 100% guarantee, do this every time and you'll be successful. Sometimes it's worth waiting for things. But most of the time, we just wait too long. We miss our opportunities because we're so indecisive, just wondering, is this actually the right time? Is something better going to come along? And then we miss out on the good opportunity that we had right in front of us. It reminded me of, there was a TV show, I think it was probably came out about 10 years ago. It was called The Good Place. I don't know if any of you watched that. It's a really interesting show to watch as a Christian, particularly if you've had any deconstruction in your faith journey, because I don't want to spoil the story, and particularly season 1 is like by far the best. I think it went for 4 seasons. By the 4th, it got a little dorky, but the first couple are really good, and the first season is really, really good. But the general idea is you have these oddball characters that all end up in heaven at the same general time, but things are starting to go wrong in heaven because one of them doesn't actually belong there, and they have to try to figure out who it is, and the person who it is has to try to not act suspicious and all of that. A really creative show. But one of the characters, his name is Chidi, and he was this ethics professor, and he was the most indecisive character possibly ever written in the history of television shows. And this guy would not even be able to make a decision on what to wear for hours and just go back and forth trying to determine the ethics of it. Like, if I wear this versus this, well, what's going to happen here? He would like play out the entire scenario in his head. And it was definitely a caricature. But I've also known people who kind of lived like that, where they just are so stunted in their ability to do anything because they're so worried about, is this actually the right thing or the right time, that they never really do anything. They just stay comfortable and even kind of complacent in the life that they've gotten used to. And it might not be a great life. It's not even like they're comfortable there because that's what they want. They're just comfortable there because that's what they know. And they never branch out. They never change. It can be something as simple as just saying, "Oh man, I really want to try that new restaurant that opened up in town." And they never do because they just keep going back to the restaurant they know because it's more comfortable, it's more familiar, there's no risk to it. Well, like we talked about last week, there's actually risk in every single activity that you partake in. There's risk in listening to this right now. There's risk in going out and getting the mail. There's risk in eating. Everything you do has some risk to it. So there's no way that we can avoid all risk. Therefore, we shouldn't not do something just because there is some risk. Where this becomes a really potent psychological cocktail is when you add a religious element into it. And when I was in Bible college, a friend of mine gave me a short little book by a pastor from southern North Carolina. His name's Kevin DeYoung. He's definitely leans heavily Calvinist and he's very reformed. So there's a lot about his doctrine and preaching that I definitely don't agree with. But the book itself really made an impact on me. Short little thing, it's called Just Do Something. I would definitely recommend it to someone who struggles with making decisions in life, particularly because of religion. Here's what happens for people who grew up like I did. We're told that God cares about every little thing that you do, and that He watches everything that you do, and that everything you do needs to be done to His glory. And so the average person hears that and they just think, okay, that means I maybe should do this or shouldn't do that. But then some of us who were raised to take the Bible literally and just trust whatever some pastor says from the pulpit are going to hear that and start agonizing over the smallest little decisions of, is this actually what God wants me to do today? And this is going to sound ridiculous to the average listener, but there are actually people out there with this kind of religious based anxiety and basically religious OCD, or a more proper psychological term for it is scrupulosity. This is kind of the extreme end of it where you start filtering everything through this lens of, is this something that God actually wants me to do? And it can be, I'm not joking here, it can be something as simple as the color shirt that you wear today, or whether you go and get another cup of coffee, right? Like it could be you have a favorite drink at Starbucks, but now you have this extreme anxiety over, well, I'm about to spend $6 on this coffee and I could be giving that to the church or to a missions organization or something like that. There are people who are dying and I'm here having a $6 cup of coffee. And granted, Starbucks coffee is not worth the $6. You can definitely get better out there, but there's nothing wrong with indulging in an occasional luxury. Life is short. We should enjoy that sort of thing. Now, obviously, we shouldn't be wasting money, but sometimes it's worth spending a little bit of extra on the nice things, if you can. Obviously, if you're in debt and have a bunch of credit card bills coming up due, you might not want to spring for the, was it a Grande, Veinte? I don't, you can tell I don't go to Starbucks. I don't know what the biggest one is. I think it's a Veinte. In fact, the last time I went to Starbucks, I ordered a Grande and I was there with a friend who was very much a Starbucks person, and she looked at me and was like, "What are you doing getting a baby drink? Get the bigger one." Like, I thought Grande was the biggest. So, I'm a tea drinker, and Starbucks has a couple of decent teas, especially after they bought out Tavana like 10 years ago, but that's a whole other rabbit trail that you don't care about. Anywho, as extreme as an example like that might sound, I actually found myself starting to get into that sort of thing by the time I was in Bible college, where I was just agonizing over the smallest little decisions of, is this actually what God wants for me? And the problem with that is it's entirely subjective. There is no voice from the skies that's going to come down and say, yes, my child, this is what I wanted you to do. So even when you determine, okay, I think this is what God wants me to do, it's still your own conscience and just internal monologue going on saying, I think this is what he wants. You don't actually know. And so the idea of this book by Kevin DeYoung, the Just Do Something, was to break down the concept of God's will. If you were in a church at all similar to how I grew up, you would hear sermons preached about following God's will. And it was constantly stated as if you had to figure out what is God's individual will for your particular life. And it was very specific. Like, he has something very specific planned for you, and you have to find that out. And I think it was supposed to be encouraging to say, hey, the creator of the universe cares enough about you to have a very specific will for you. That sounds great until you actually have to try to put feet to it and now figure out, well, how do I figure that out? And you can't. And so you start agonizing over every single little detail. Let's look at an example of who to marry. This was a pretty common one. If you have to try to find God's will of who to marry, well, there's, to use the overused expression, lots of fish in the sea. So how do you know which one it is? And how do you know that the way that you know is actually accurate? And yeah, you got the people who say, oh, I prayed about it, and the Lord really just laid this on my heart, or I just prayed for a sign that God would send someone walking through that door, and that would be the person I'm supposed to marry. Or, yeah, as ridiculous as it sounds, that was real. And in fact, it got even crazier. I even knew somebody, no joke, that was convinced, despite so many people telling them it was a bad idea, that they were supposed to marry one particular person because the veins on the back of their hand spelled out that person's first name initial. So that was their idea of a sign from God that this is God's will, I'm supposed to marry this person. You see how ridiculous this becomes really fast? Good, smart people get taken into this because it's what's preached. And I don't think there are too many pastors or preachers or evangelists or whatever that actually want you to live that way, but they don't realize that that's the effect their words have. It just creates this extreme religious anxiety. So to just kind of break down the idea of DeYoung's book for you, it was that God has a general will. Believe it or not, there's only a few times that the will of God is laid out in Scripture. Like, this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you, right? That sort of verse. There's only a few of them, and they're very general principles. It's nothing about thou shalt go to this college, thou shalt marry this person, thou shalt wear this outfit, thou shalt take this job interview. Yeah? None of that. And it's just very general stuff about pray, love others, be a good person sort of thing. So DeYoung laid it out as God has this very general will that as long as you're not violating the general will, you're within his will. You are doing what God wants you to do. We seem to think that God's will for all of us was like a path, and you had to find in an entire horizon filled with paths going in every possible direction which one was the one for you. And what DeYoung was saying is actually it was more like a giant box, and the parameters of the box are the parameters of God's will. That's what he laid out. Don't go outside of the box. But as long as you're hanging in the box, you're good. And the box is a lot bigger than a lot of us tended to think. So, I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but I think he really had a point there, and I found it very freeing. A lot of other people have as well, that we don't have to try to find what is this exact specific little thing that God wants me to do in this next instance here. It's more so just going through a filter of, is this within the general parameters of God's will? One of the verses that I would often use in counseling for this is 2 Timothy 1:7. That says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And I would lay out that the word for power is the idea of ability. Love, well, it doesn't say love for whom there. Is that love for God, love for people, love for self? I think it could be all three. And then sound mind is actually balanced thinking. So I would say this decision that you have here, is what you are doing, trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, is it increasing your fear, your anxiety, your worry over this? Because if so, that is a surefire way to know that's not the right way to go about it. But if it increases your own ability, or you could say your own self-confidence, your own self-assurance, your own capability, if it's increasing love for God, self, or others, and if it's increasing and in line with balanced thinking, in other words, not just one particular viewpoint, but you're able to take in multiple possibilities here and listen to multiple perspectives, then if it checks those boxes, that's the right way to go. And what if you have multiple options that check those boxes? Well, then any of those are good. Go with the one that you like most. See, God isn't some killjoy up in heaven that's trying to make you miserable. He wants to make you happy. And this is where we've totally misunderstood the do's and don'ts and stuff of the Bible. We've presented them as very restrictive when actually they're more so just common sense things that we have misinterpreted because we are a couple thousand years and an entire half a world away. They're not as restrictive as we tend to think, and God isn't trying to ruin our fun. He's actually trying to give us the best life that we possibly can. So if there's multiple good options, go with the one that you like most, and that will please God because it is still within His broad will and it makes you happy. That's a good thing. So moving forward, let's take Qoheleth's advice. Let's stop obsessing over these things that are out of our control and stop trying to add a religious element to things that don't have to have that. Is this hurting you or anyone else? No? Okay. Is it checking off these general boxes that we talked about, like increasing love, ability, capability, and balanced thinking? Yeah? All right. Then we're good to go. And which one do I take? Do I go this way or that? Well, don't wait for the perfect opportunity to come. You're going to regret the stuff that you don't do in life more than the stuff that you do in life. See, we're all going to make mistakes. We are all going to occasionally walk through the wrong door and take the wrong path. But you can always start over again. You can't start over again if you never start. It's better to start something, realize you made a mistake, fix it, and either keep going now that you fixed it or start on something else than it is never to start for fear of making a mistake. Remember Qoheleth's metaphor about the clouds raining and the trees falling. Life is going to happen with or without you, and you only get a handful of decades here on this earth. So why are you going to let it pass you by? Why are you going to let everything that God put on this earth for you to enjoy be missed out on because you're worried about X, Y, or Z thing? Just go do something. It doesn't have to be the perfect thing. It doesn't have to be the thing you're going to do for the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be your favorite thing that you've ever done. Just get out there and try something you want to do because life is short and you're not guaranteed the opportunity to try it again tomorrow. If you like it, great. If not, well, now you know and you can try something else. See, this is what I absolutely love about Ecclesiastes. So many people come to the Bible and they think they're going to get this moral list of do's and don'ts and thou shalts and thou shalt nots. But this is super practical advice, and it's so relevant for today. And that this is the sort of thing that just gets overlooked. You're not going to hear this preached, but it's right here in the Bible, and it is so encouraging and freeing and liberating. And isn't that what reading the Bible is supposed to be? Doesn't the Bible itself say where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty? So as we find liberty in these words of Qoheleth, I think we can be confident that the Spirit of the Lord is here with us in that interpretation. Verse 5, though it reads a little funky in English, is relatively easy enough to understand. It's the idea that you don't know which way the spirit or wind is going. You don't know how a baby grows in a mother's womb, and likewise, you don't understand the ways of God. But if you read from a handful of translations, you're going to realize that there's some variance here. And this is a verse that people in the pro-life camp are going to use as an anti-abortion verse. You say, well, where are we getting that? Well, it comes from a particular way of translating this verse. And the first thing that you need to realize is that the word spirit there is ruach again. So it can mean wind, it can mean breath, it can mean spirit. And so some people will look at this and read it as spirit in the sense of like the Holy Spirit or the quickening spirit, a spirit of life. And then they're going to combine the first and second lines of the verse together to say something along the lines of, just like you don't know how the spirit is in the bones in the womb of her that is with child. So they're going to combine the idea of the way of the spirit with the bones growing in the womb. So they're going to say that the spirit enters into the bones growing in the womb. That is something that some Hebrew manuscripts do actually have. I believe the Targum reads that way as well. And the Message Bible actually kind of goes along with that interpretation in this instance. It says, just as you'll never understand the mystery of life forming in a pregnant woman, so you'll never understand the mystery at work in all that God does. And I want to be fair and say that is a possible interpretation just solely based on grammar. But I think when we stop and apply a little logic to it, it doesn't actually work. First off, although there is some oxygen in bones, the ancients would not have realized that. They did not have that sort of medical knowledge to think, oh, when we breathe, oxygen is seeping into our bones a little bit. Now, I know some people would say, oh, well, God knew it, so he just inspired them to write that way. Well, if that's the case, why didn't he have them change the parts about a flat earth or about the sun going around the earth or any of the other scientific inaccuracies that are in the Bible? So it just doesn't make sense for God to give them supernatural future knowledge of some things and not others. And another big part of this is that we can't read the Christian idea of the Holy Spirit into these verses, or even an older idea of a quickening spirit going into somebody's body here. These verses are not about the Spirit of God. They have been more so about the wind or the breath. There's really been nothing about God's Spirit in Ecclesiastes. It's more so about our own life breath. So while it is a possible dictionary definition of the word, that doesn't mean that it's the best one in this context. And a third problem I have with it, and this is where it gets really controversial, is that's not the way that the ancients viewed pregnancy. Going to give a really quick content warning here because I do need to talk very briefly about abortion in relation to this. I'm not going into any kind of gory graphic detail, but just wanted to mention that right here. It's only going to be for a minute or so, so I'm going to put the times in the show notes in, just in case. But in the ancient world, they did not have the same abortion debate that we have today. Now, this is not an episode on abortion. We are actually going to do one in the pretty near future here on what the Bible says about abortion. But just dealing with this particular verse, it's worth realizing that the ancient Israelites of this time did not believe life began at conception. And most of the time, they did not even believe that life began at implantation or at some point within the pregnancy process. It's actually that life begins at birth. Now, again, I realize that's a controversial statement, and if that sort of thing interests you, we will be doing another episode on that in the future here. But I just wanted to put that out here, not to say, oh, abortion is great, so let's go out and encourage it. No, but just to say that if we're going to hold a biblical position on any topic, we need to be fair to what the Bible is actually saying and not read in our own political agendas. And I fear that abortion is one of the biggest topics that Christians today are coming to the Bible with their determinations of what the Bible says already established. So then they have to find Bible verses to use as proof texts, and they have to ignore or twist any others out of context that might seem to go against it. So I'm not saying that this is a pro-abortion verse. I'm just saying that this is a verse that actually has no bearing on the abortion debate whatsoever. This is not talking about the Holy Spirit, nor is it talking about a breath of life entering into a child in the mother's womb. It is better just to translate this verse as, just as you don't understand what is the way of the Ruach, or the bones in the belly of the one who is full. That's a Hebraism for the pregnant woman there, the one who is full. I do not recommend calling a pregnant woman that, but, that's what Qoheleth did, and hey, if he was Solomon and the wisest person who ever lived, no, I still don't recommend calling a pregnant woman fool. But that's the Hebrew term for it here. So just as you don't understand what is the way of the Ruach, or the bones in the belly of the one who is full, so you don't know the end goal of God who made all. That's a very literal rendering of the verse. So it's not talking about breath entering into a child in a mother's womb. It's saying that just like you don't understand the way the wind blows, and just like you don't understand how a child forms in a mother's womb, so God's plans are above your comprehension. So regardless on where you stand on the abortion debate, let's be really careful not to use verses like this out of context. Let them say their own thing. You don't need to back up your position with a verse taken out of context. That only weakens your position when someone who actually knows the Bible comes in and says, yeah, that's not what that's saying. I also want to point out here that this verse doesn't need to be taken in the, oh, well, God's ways are higher than our ways, so we can't ask questions. We just got to settle for mystery. We've talked about this before in this series so far. I think statements like this would have had a little more punch back in Qoheleth's day. Today, too many preachers overuse these sorts of phrases to explain away anything that they haven't taken the time to study enough. But Qoheleth isn't just using this as an easy out. He's saying, we don't know the way the world works. And sometimes it follows a Proverbs like black and white pattern. And other times it's really gray and it's really hard to determine what the best decision to make is. You can try to figure it out. You might even find out some things, but you're never going to figure it all out. So don't waste your whole life trying to explain the mysteries of the universe. And if you do, I mean, know what you're getting into. It's a really difficult task, and some stuff is probably just going to be a little bit out of your grasp. So don't have these massive delusions of grandeur. It's okay not to know everything. From so early on, what's one of the first things a kid learns to ask? Why? And then they never shut up asking about that. Just why? In a lot of ways, we as adults do the same thing. We ask, why did this happen this way? And we don't always get those answers. And that's not to say that we shouldn't try to find an answer. It's to say that we need to learn to be okay with not always knowing. So I think that's more so what Qoheleth is getting at there. Moving into verse 6, I like how Shapiro in the Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained commentary had it. Nevertheless, plant seed in the morning, and do not let your hands be idle in the evening. There is no way to know which of your efforts, this one or that one, will succeed, and perhaps both may turn out for the good. So that phrase of withhold not your hand, it's literally don't let your hand rest. Murphy has pointed out that it can be read as in the evening or until evening. So either sow your seed in the morning, sow your seed in the evening, or start sowing your seed in the morning and don't quit even until evening. Either one is possible, and the Net Bible Notes actually saw it as a merism of just talking about morning and evening as a way of saying all day. In other words, work hard all day, because you don't actually know what the end result is going to be. It's easy to just go in a little bit, not go all in, hedge a few bets, and just say, I'm just going to put in a little bit. Well, low risk, low return, high risk, high return. And so he's trying to say, go all in. Dive in headfirst into the swimming pool of life. Murphy went on to say the concluding line in verse 6 provides a title for this section. You don't know what good might happen. In a similar way, 11.2b provides a title for 10.16 to 11.2. You don't know what evil could happen. This reminded me of a skit on YouTube. There's a group called Studio C, and there were a bunch of comedians that would do sketch comedy, short videos on YouTube. And there was a great one where the one guy was playing like a fortune teller sort of thing, and the one girl comes in and asks, she says, I have this trip coming up and I want to know, should I go on it? Is anything good going to happen? Is anything bad going to happen? And to every possible thing, the fortune teller goes,
Oh, anything could be fun. It's all perspective, really.
Anything could be bad, too.
It could be. It could be very bad. But it could be fun, though. It could be.
And that's just how he responds to everything. I'll try to link to it in the show notes or something. If you haven't watched it, take the time to watch it. But it's only a few minutes. But it kind of reminded me of what Qoheleth is saying here with this, like, you don't know what could happen. It could be fun, though. Like, yes, it could be horrible. It could be the worst thing that's ever happened to you. But it could be fun, though. And you just don't know. So go in with it. And yes, there's risk, but there's also potential for reward. All right, verses 7 to 10. Truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. Now, that is medically horrible advice, particularly after the eclipse we had this year. It is not good for the eyes to see the sun. But if we render this literally in Hebrew, it is good to the eyes to see the sun. that phrase, good to the eyes, sounds really similar to the wording in Genesis 3 about when the woman saw the tree was pleasant to the eyes and good for eating. So it reminded me of that. And if you have listened to our Genesis 1 through 6 series, you'll remember that there's this theme that starts there in the garden and continues through a good bit of the rest of the Bible, where characters see what looks good to them, but it turns out actually to not be what is best in that situation. And so I think his using this wording causes us to consider how many times we see things that look good, but actually aren't as good as they seem. Now, seeing the sun, we have to think about how throughout this entire book, he has talked about life under the sun, and whatever is beyond the sun is death. So seeing the sun, I think, is a metaphor for life. And it's only fitting then that, as we'll read in just a few minutes here in the next verse, he talks about the days of darkness, and that's going to be a metaphor for death. And well, you know what, let's just go ahead and read verse 8, because it ties in here. If a man lives many years and rejoices in all of them, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that comes is vanity. Most of the time, we don't like to think about death. I know plenty of people who don't even want to write out a last will and testament or don't want to get life insurance simply because they don't want to think about death. But Qoheleth says it's actually good for us to think about death while we're yet alive, because it allows us to enjoy life to the fullest. We talked about that several chapters ago. I think that was like chapters 5 through 6 or so. He really had this emphasis on don't shy away from thinking about death. Well, actually, it goes even earlier, because he talks about being in the house of mourning versus the house of feasting and all that. It even goes into chapter 3. So this is a consistent theme for him, that we shouldn't be afraid of death. We should be willing to think about it and keep it even in the forefront of our minds in life, because then we can enjoy life more, because we realize how short it is. And so then seeing the sun is a metaphor for life. Seeing the sun is kind of like seeing your life in whole. It serves as a summary of one's life. It's like seeing your life in perspective. In other words, it's good to live, but it's also true that
life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something.
Several commentators have noted a quote from Euripides, who was a possible contemporary of Qoheleth, and he had a very similar phrase to what Qoheleth said in verse 7, where Qoheleth says, truly the light is sweet. Euripides said, sweet it is to see the light. So I could definitely see them maybe swapping notes there. And that idea of sweetness, it's a metaphor frequently used throughout the Bible for scriptures themselves. Particularly in the Psalms, there's a lot of talk about God's words being sweet like honey. It's so interesting to me that Qoheleth now talks about life itself as being of that same sweet value. We have to remember, in a world before processed candy, sweet things had to be savored because they weren't as common. Today I can go to the local gas station and get as much candy as I could possibly eat in a month. But that's not the way it's been through most of human history, and probably for the better. So when you had something naturally sweet like honey, it was something to be cherished and enjoyed and savored. And that's what life is as well. So it's a beautiful metaphor that's tellingly lost on us in today's culture. Just as we have made so much candy that we don't even appreciate sweetness anymore. I mean, there's sugar in everything in our American diets. So it is that we have processed life to the point that we don't enjoy those little sweet moments anymore. And we have to kind of detox in life from it in order to fully enjoy and understand the goodness that we have. Verse 8 says, if a man lives many years and rejoice in all of them, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that comes is hevel. There is all kinds of creation language in this verse. The word for man is Adam, living many years, right? That takes us back to the lifespans in early Genesis. Remembering is also the word for naming that we had in Genesis. We have days, we have darkness. So I think this is all hyperlinking back to the creation story. Most good scholars will tell you that the verse means that death awaits all of us. When he says the days of darkness are many, he means you're going to be dead longer than you've been alive. And that's true. I also think we can read this as finding value in both the highs and lows of life, because there are dark days even while we still see the sun, right? There are days even in our lives that are going to feel like death. There are going to be days of darkness. And even then, we should not run and hide from them. We don't have to wish for them to come, but we have to realize that they are going to. A roller coaster with no hills, with no climbs and drops, isn't a roller coaster. That's basically just a trolley ride. We need the highs and lows to bring some excitement. We don't appreciate the highs without the lows. I was having a conversation just this past week with a friend of mine who asked, now that I'm on this side of my faith journey, would I change the way that I grew up if I could? And there are several things that I wish would have been different. There are a lot of things about the version of Christianity I grew up in that were not healthy and not even biblically accurate. But by the same token, if anything were to change, I would not be the me sitting here right now talking to you. Change one thing, and I'm not the same person. And neither are you. It's kind of the butterfly effect. Right? The smallest little change in a timeline can make the biggest difference. That's the plot of every single time travel movie ever. And we go back and we start to think about our lives, and if you would change anything, I get it, but by the same token, it's almost like you can't. Because if you go back to change something, you no longer become the you that got to the point that he was able to go back and change something. So can you even change something because you're no longer that version of yourself? So for better or for worse, I'm the me that's sitting here right now. And there has definitely been both better and worse. And even though there's stuff that I definitely wish didn't happen the way it did, it's part of what got me here. And so isn't that, in a sense, a good thing? I'm not saying that bad things are good things because good can come out of them, but we can't just pick the good parts of life. Life isn't a buffet where we just pick our favorite parts. Life has hills and valleys, and without the worst parts of your life, you wouldn't be the good you that you are right now. It's kind of like in How I Met Your Mother, how Ted, is telling the story of his life to his kids, and pretty frequently says, I did this stupid thing, but if it hadn't happened this way, I never would have met your mother, and you kids never would have been born. So we have to look at life in this complex way that says, yeah, the bad parts sucked, but they're part of what got me to the good version of me that I am right now. And so, would I change anything? I don't honestly know. We can find good in both the good and the bad because they made us better. And the end of the verse is a little weird to translate. It's all that comes is Hevel. Literally, all that enters is Hevel. Well, enters what exactly? I guess life? I'm not 100% sure on what Qoheleth meant there, and a lot of commentators tend to just gloss over it. But I think what he's trying to say is either everything that comes beyond this life, so everything in the days of darkness, everything in the days of death, is Hevel. But he's also said that life is Hevel, so I'm not sure that that view of it, saying that everything that comes after life is Hevel, I don't think that makes sense, because he's already talked about life itself being Hevel. So I think he means that all that happens in this life is Hevel, good or bad. The good times are fleeting, and so are the bad. So no matter how soul-crushing and world-ending today might feel, before too long, there's going to be a good day. And we just tend to focus so much on trying to avoid the bad days and get to a good day that we just miss the days. And so much of our life goes by without us appreciating the day that we're in. The Good News Bible said, "Be grateful for every year you live. No matter how long you live, remember you'll be dead much longer." The New Century Version put it, "People ought to enjoy every day of their lives, no matter how long they live. But also remember this, you will be dead a long time." So, both good reminders. Verses 9 and 10. Now we've reached the end of the chapter. These are fun. This is a couple weeks in a row now that we've had my favorite part of the chapter at the very end. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you all the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, because childhood and youth are Hevel. Now, if you come from a conservative background, your heresy detector is probably going off the charts right now, because it sure sounded like Qoheleth said, follow your heart and party it up. And guess what? That is exactly what he's saying to do here. I get it. I came from a very conservative background, and all I ever heard was, don't party it up. Don't live life to the fullest. Don't sow wild oats. Be very mild-mannered and basically puritanical. Don't even cheer too loud at the sports game. Don't go crazy. Be refined and dignified in everything. Basically act like you're in Victorian England. Well, that's not what Qoheleth is saying. And as I read this, I was kind of shocked looking at the complete Jewish Bible. A lot of times they have good translations there, but it's a perfect illustration in this case of letting your conservative bias get in the way of your translation. See, they translated it, young person, if you spend your youth only having fun, if you use your early years just to entertain yourself, if you follow your heart as you live your life and let your eyes be your guide, understand that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. There's only one problem with that. There are no ifs in this verse. This is not a conditional saying, if you go party it up, God is going to judge you. No, these are imperative statements. He is saying, do these things. More technically, they're actually jussive statements, which is more of like a blessing. May you do these things. Go ahead and do these things. So he's saying, go ahead, let your heart cheer you, be happy, walk in the ways of your heart. He literally just said there, follow your heart and follow the sight of your eyes. Now, that definitely has worried commentators throughout the years, long before even Christianity. In fact, just when the Septuagint translation was being made, the Greek version of the Old Testament, they changed this verse completely. They added in the word amomos, or blameless, after heart, and the negation may before eyes. So the Greek version of this verse actually reads, follow the inclination of your heart blamelessly, but not the desire of your eyes. And there's even midrashic traditions of rabbis debating over this verse because of how it seems to contradict, at least for some people, Numbers 15:39 that talks about not going after your heart and following your eyes. So what the heck is going on here? Is Qoheleth giving you bad advice? Is he telling you to follow your heart? Is he telling you to go against the rest of the Bible? Well, I will definitely say the way that he presents it is novel. There's not a lot else like this in Scripture. But I don't think what he's saying here is actually contradictory to the rest of the Bible's message. He does actually say, walk in the ways of your heart, follow your heart, go after what your eyes desire, party, live it up. But then we have to read it in conjunction with the last part of this verse where he says, know that for these God will bring you into judgment. And I know some people are going to be quick to hop on that and say, aha, he's basically canceling it out, saying party if you want, but God's going to judge you for it. Well, let's not be so hasty to that. Remember that judgment in the Bible is not automatically negative. God judges both good works and bad works. So we have to realize this isn't saying God will condemn you for what you do. It's saying God is going to judge what you do to see if it was right or wrong. This is a good time to revisit the idea of the fear of Yahweh, or the fear of God, or the fear of the Lord. We talked about this a few chapters back, because it does show up a couple times in Ecclesiastes, and people have misunderstood what it meant. So I want to read this a little bit from The Philosophy of Qoheleth by Joel Steele. The fear of the Lord, therefore, is not an emotion of terror that accompanies stress and anxiety from a subject who dreads punishment. The phrase exemplifies true reverence for God and humility. The value in the phrase begins to materialize when humanity seeks to understand this order in the universe. This is the context in which Qoheleth used the term fear God. In other words, life has meaning concealed from humanity's knowledge. However, only God knows the secret decree. Therefore, enjoy your life by finding pleasure in your work and embrace those you love, because these things don't exist in Sheol. Further, since your life is mere breath and you will be held responsible for your deeds in God's judgment, banish anxiety from your mind and have reverence for God. Perhaps it can be interpreted from these passages that individuals whose circumstances are favorable in life but fail to enjoy their life will be held accountable before God. Let me just reread that again for a second, make sure that sunk in. Perhaps it can be interpreted from these passages that individuals whose circumstances are favorable in life but fail to enjoy their life will be held accountable before God. Now, then he quotes verse 9 again, and I want you to hear that again in this new light. Rejoice, young man, while you're young. Let your heart cheer in the days of your youth. Follow the inclinations of your heart and the desire of your eyes. But know for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. It's likely that the author of this book would have been in a position to enjoy much pleasure in life. Moreover, he appears to conclude that there is an obligation to enjoy life. Get that? There is an obligation to enjoy life, though not as a hedonist. End quote. I thought the New Living Translation did a really good job with this verse, piggybacking off of what Steele said. Young people, it's wonderful to be young. Enjoy every minute of it. Do everything you want to. Take it all in. But remember that you must give an account to God for everything you do. I also like the International Standard Version, which is a little rare. I don't usually care much for their translations, but this was a good one. So enjoy yourself in your youth, young man, and be encouraged during your younger days. Live as you like, consistent with your worldview, but keep in mind that God will bring you to account for everything. Murphy, in the Word Biblical Commentary, points out a similarity to the Latin phrase gaudimus igitur juvenes dum sumus. Pardon my Latin, it's not my strongest language. But interestingly enough, there is a very popular song in European graduation ceremonies that draws on this phrase. It's at least from the 1200s CE, but we don't actually know the complete origin of it. But it goes by the same name. It's either De Brevite Vitae, for on the shortness of life, or Gaudimus Igitur, which means so let us rejoice. But I just wanted to take a second and read this song to you, because it's going on 800 years old at a minimum now, and it fits really well with what Qoheleth said. So an English translation. So let us rejoice while we are young. After a pleasant youth, after a troublesome old age, the earth will have us. Where are they who, before us, were in the world? Go to the heavens, cross over into hell, where they went through already. Our life is brief. Soon it will end. Death comes quickly, snatches us cruelly. To nobody shall it be spared. Long live the academy, long live the professors, long live each student, long live the whole fraternity, forever may they flourish. Long live all virgins, easy and beautiful. Long live mature women, too, tender and lovable, good and hard-working. All of you need to stop snickering right now. Long live the state as well, and he who rules it. Long live our city and the charity of benefactors which protects us here. May sadness perish, may haters perish, may the devil perish, and also the opponents of the fraternities and their mockers too. That really sounds similar to the sentiment that Qoheleth has here. So Murphy pointed that out, and then he also pointed to Ptahhotep in ancient Egypt that said, follow your heart as long as you live. Do no more than is already required. Do not shorten the time of follow the heart. Trimming its moment offends the Ka. Don't waste time on daily cares, beyond providing for your household. When wealth has come, follow your heart. Wealth does no good if one is glum. Let's keep adding a couple more things in here so we can get a fuller picture of this verse. Brown in the interpretation commentary said, there are those who eat in darkness, full of resentment, for they have toiled endlessly, denying themselves with nothing to show for it. And he points out chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 and 5:17 that talked about that as well. They have sacrificed the opportunity for joy upon the altar of elusive gain. But then there are those who, because they neither took for granted nor denied themselves the blessings of life's serendipities, can face their impending days of darkness with acceptance and even contentment. Such is the key to human existence for the sage, to relinquish control over life in order to be freed for joy. And he goes on to say, this theme of judgment at the end of the verse is designed not to temper Qoheleth's command to enjoy life, but to underscore and direct it. For Qoheleth, the enjoyment of life becomes the highest dictate of life. Now, see, many scholars are going to say that the end of this verse is an editorial insertion. And it definitely fits the language of the frame narrator better than it does Qoheleth. But that by no means suggests it's diametrically opposed to what Qoheleth has advocated. Too many people who read Ecclesiastes think the frame narrator is there to correct Qoheleth and to make him more orthodox. That doesn't have to be the case. The end of this verse about God bringing you into judgment for what you do or don't do doesn't have to be read as a corrective as much as another angle from which to view Qoheleth's advice. Let's consider what it is that God is bringing us into judgment for. He just says, these things. That doesn't just have to be the following your heart and eyes. I think he's actually talking about the wisdom of the book as a whole. For all these things that I have told you about, God will bring you into judgment. You are accountable for this understanding now, because you can't say, I'm ignorant of that. I don't know what God wants out of my life. I don't know how to live a good life. No, I have just spent 11 chapters telling you how to live the good life. So God is now going to consider you accountable for how you lived your life, because I told you how to make the most out of it. I almost said the secret to life, but I don't think Qoheleth would put it that way. There is no secret to life. It's almost like the secret to life is there is no secret to life. So he said, because I have laid all this out for you, now you are going to be responsible for God on whether or not you lived the good life. Perhaps we shouldn't read the end of that verse as limiting, but rather as encouraging. Why do we assume that God will only be disappointed in a life lived too hard, in somebody who partied a little too much? What if God will be equally disappointed in a life not lived enough? Think about that for a second. God gave you so much to enjoy in this world. Why would you deny yourself that, as if somehow you're not enjoying what God gave you is going to make him happy with you? If someone gave me a super generous gift and I said, oh, you know what, I'm actually not going to use that because I don't want to risk it breaking, or I don't want to use it for the wrong purposes, they're not going to be happy with me. They're not going to go, oh, you know what, you're really wise. I'm so glad that you chose not to use my gift. Now, they'd probably be pissed, and they would feel like they wasted money on me. And, well, I'd say they'd be right. Now, please realize neither Qoheleth nor I are suggesting a completely hedonistic lifestyle of go out, do whatever you want, and don't give a crap about anybody else. That is harmful, and that goes against the Bible. But there are so many aspects of life as a whole that so many Christians get so puritanical about and say, oh no, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't. And it's never in the Bible. And they try to use Bible verses twisted out of context to say you shouldn't do those things. But there's so much goodness in the world that God made to be enjoyed. And what makes you think that there's only a slippery slope on one edge of the mountain? Mountains have more than one edge. And it's not just the left side of the mountain that has a slippery slope. The right side does too. You can go too far in either direction. And just like God wouldn't be pleased if you wasted your life on riotous living, he also wouldn't be pleased if you wasted your life on no living. I think Jesus himself actually confirms this in the parable of the talents. You remember that one? It's where the master has 3 slaves that he gives a particular amount of resources to and says, do something with this while I'm gone. When I come back, I expect a return on my investment. And he comes back, and the first 2 double whatever they had. I think it was 5 and 3 in most of the accounts. So the guy with 5 measures of resources now has 10. The one with 3 now has 6. And the one who only got 1 just said, I went and buried it in the backyard. I was afraid of losing it. I was afraid of damaging it. I was afraid that I wouldn't get enough return back. Maybe those guys doubled it and I only got half back. So, I only have 1.5 now, and you'd be really mad at me. And the master doesn't say, oh, well done, good and faithful servant. You were conservative with what I gave you. You didn't lose anything. Isn't that so interesting? He didn't lose anything, but the master doesn't praise that. The master says, wicked, slothful servant. You could have at least gotten some interest on it. You wasted the gift that I gave. And I can't help but think that so many Christians are going to get to heaven with their hand out expecting a praise from God, and God's just going to slap it away and say, why did you waste the life that I gave you? You didn't enjoy anything. You gave up so much for me that I never asked you to give up. Why? Why would you waste that? What Qoheleth is saying here is kind of a slap in the face to so much of fundamental and even conservative Christianity, where he's saying you have missed the boat. You have made your religion about not living life. And that's never what religion was supposed to be about. Religion is supposed to be about living the best life possible, about living a better life, about getting to the good life. And you've just turned this into a whole bunch of do's and don'ts that miss out on everything. And it just creates so much anxiety because you're constantly worried about, if I do the slightest little thing here, God's going to want to strike me down with a lightning bolt. That's not good. That's not the point at all. In Jesus' parable, and I think even in the mind of Qoheleth, conservative caution is punished and risk-laden ventures are rewarded. So yes, you will face judgment at the end of your life, but not just for the sins you didn't commit, but also for the enjoyment that you didn't live out because you were too afraid of doing the wrong thing. I know some of you listening are really bristling up at this idea because you have been indoctrinated to have such a fear of doing anything that goes against God. Perfect love casts out fear. Remember was it 2 Timothy 1:7 we talked about earlier? If it's increasing your fear, it's not of God. So if what you're hearing in church every week is just making you more anxious over whether or not you're actually pleasing God, that's not pleasing to God. God made this life to be lived. Again, not hedonism, not whatever I want goes, not to the detriment of somebody else. No, but there's a lot of room in between those two extremes that I think we're still supposed to live in. And so his conclusion to this chapter is, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are hevel. Interestingly, that second word for youth at the end of the verse is a word that only appears here in the entirety of the Tanakh. The fancy word for that is hepax legamina. It's a one-time word. The Septuagint and Syriac versions mistranslate it as folly, actually. So youth and folly are hevel. That's not at all what it means. It's most likely a word that means black. Youth and black are hevel. The idea would be dark hair, because as you get older, hair lightens in color. So it's a poetic way of describing youth. And if that's the case, it comes from the root shakor. However, there are some translators that think it actually comes from a similar root, shakar, in which case it would mean dawn. In other words, the start of life. Either way, it is a poetic picture of youth. I was disappointed to see so many versions tip their hand and reveal their poor understanding of Qoheleth's philosophy in this verse. The NIV claims youth and vigor are meaningless. The ISV says childhood and the prime of life are pointless. The New Living Translation said youth is meaningless. Complete Jewish Bible, neither adolescence nor youth has any lasting value. Wow, yikes, man, way to totally kill the vibe and to send the exact opposite message from what Qoheleth is trying to say. You can go back to our first couple episodes where I talk more about what hevel means and why things like meaninglessness and pointless or no lasting value, those aren't good translations at all. Hevel just means fleeting. It means you can't hang on to it. You can't make it stay for as long as you want it to. He's not saying youth is dumb, don't enjoy your childhood. No, quite the opposite. He's saying youth doesn't last. You're going to be an adult most of your life. Enjoy the time when you don't have aches and pains and bills to pay and so many other struggles that go with adulting. Just enjoy the moment that you're in. We've created a culture that rushes young people into adulthood. They want to be old enough to drive. They want to be old enough to have their first drink. They want to be old enough to go to college. They want to be old enough to get out of the house. And we're constantly pushing them to all of those things. But life only gets harder the older you get. So pursue as much fun as possible while you're young. While it's true that Qoheleth is addressing youth here, I can just picture him actually making eye contact with the parents in the room while he said this. warning them against forcing their children to grow up too fast. Brown said, Qoheleth is safeguarding a stage of life from being crushed by excessive responsibilities and their accompanying worries. Youth, Qoheleth contends, is that liminal stage in the maturation process that must be carefully nurtured and protected. It is the preface to full adulthood that must remain exempt, however fleetingly, from self-restraining responsibilities and concerns. Whereas conventional wisdom consistently casts a weary eye toward the vagaries of youth, seeking to rein in youth's impetuosity, Qoheleth provides a refreshingly positive view. While the son in Proverbs 1 through 9 remains silent and submissive, the young man in Ecclesiastes is exhorted to exert himself in joy. Qoheleth, the old sage, much like a typical grandparent, provides the necessary balance to the harsh admonitions of the parental voice in Proverbs. The combined effect is the formative education of youth. End quote. I thought that was beautifully said. It's also a good reminder for the rest of us that young people are still growing, and they will do stupid things. That's just a part of maturing. In the teenage years, the brain is literally rewiring itself from the ground up. So if you ever see a teen do something stupid and you say, what's wrong? You have half a brain? Well, yeah, kind of actually in the moment they do, because it's just rewiring. That's why teens do stupid stuff. They are physiologically rebooting the entire system. They're getting an upgrade. I think even that's kind of the idea in Inside Out 2 that came out recently. So, well, a couple weeks in a row now we've referenced Pixar as well, and particularly that movie. So go watch Inside Out. That's better therapy than most people get. But it's a good reminder for us to give young people grace. It's so easy to get short-tempered when we see young people do stupid things. And a big part of that is because it reminds us of the stupid things that we did when we were that age and how embarrassing that is now on this side of it. And because we haven't learned to process that ourselves, we just take it out on them instead of realizing, I wish someone would have given me a little more grace at that time, so maybe I should give it to them as well. Let's look here before we close out on what does it mean to remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh. A lot of translations and commentaries I saw gave those two words, sorrow and evil, as trouble and suffering. Put away trouble from your heart and suffering from your flesh. That's a little better, but still not quite there. I saw others that talked about anxiety and pain. Put away anxiety from your heart and pain from your body. That's getting closer. And I think it's interesting in that case that both of those things are assumed in youth. I mean, teens definitely have a lot of anxiety. But what pain is he referring to? I guess you could say maybe growing pains, but you can't really put that away from your body. Like, you can't control that. I think a better translation is to say, turn away from the anger of your heart and walk past the evil of your body, because youth and dark hair are temporary. Taken this way, I see it as meaning that the raging emotions of puberty that you feel are real, but not reality. So don't act on them. It's natural to feel this anger and rage as you're dealing with new emotions and feelings that you don't understand yourself. And that's totally okay. There is nothing wrong with that. But we need to be careful how we act on those. That's part of the growing up process, is learning not always to act on every emotion that we feel. Taking the time to consider, what am I actually feeling? Where in my body am I feeling this? Where is this hurt coming from? Why might I be feeling that? Is there any reason that I might be a little upset? Is there anything that set me off? Did I remember to eat today? Did I sleep well enough? Did I get enough water today? Do I just need to get up, get some fresh air, and use the bathroom, and then come back and be better? Like, that's all part of the learning process. I think that's closer to what he's saying, is basically don't just give in to all of these emotions that you feel. Don't live your life solely by emotion. Start learning how to coexist with them in a healthy way. And ideally, that would come from parents and maybe a church community explaining that. But unfortunately, most parents don't even know how to control their own emotions because their parents didn't know, and it just keeps going further and further back. So thankfully, that's actually a really good thing about living in this internet age, is there are a crap ton of books and podcasts and even social media videos that are sharing bits of therapeutic advice. Now, you have to be careful. Obviously, not everyone out there is an expert, and not everything that people say is good, but there's an abundance of information now on how to have a healthier emotional mindset than what there was even when I was growing up. I wish I had access to some of that stuff now. Going back to Brown, Qoheleth specifically advises the young person to remove all obstacles that would prevent him or her from taking on those life-affirming adventures that naturally fall within youth's domain. If such occasions for joy are avoided in the name of duty or shunned because of angst or self-righteous denial, they will no doubt be counted as opportunities forever lost later in life. Qoheleth's call to joy is thus an urgent one for young and old alike. Qoheleth's exhortation is the closest the sage ever gets to a divine imperative. His peculiar ethos of joy rests upon two fundamental assumptions: the vanity or brevity of life and the prospect of divine accountability. So we're back now to the idea that you will regret more in life what you didn't do than what you did do. Life only gets harder the older you get, so pursue fun as much as possible when you're young. That is, in many ways, what Qoheleth himself did. We tend to assume he's trying to tell you through this book not to live big like he did, but he never actually says that. Quite the opposite. He talks about all the fun that he had. The point wasn't that all the stuff he did was bad. It's that he was trying to find something that lasted, and none of it lasted. He never says, oh, all the wine, women, and song that I enjoyed, don't do that. No, he's saying, do that, but not for the same reason that I did. He wants you to pursue everything he did. His whole point isn't that fun is bad. It's that fun won't last. So have it while you can, and look for places it might be hiding on the harder days. Still to this day, I have never once heard a preacher speak on the end of this chapter. It is antithetical to the ethics of many Christians, but it's at the core of Qoheleth's life-giving message. He has saved the punch of his message for the end, because now we are coming right up on the last chapter. And he says, do what I did, but not for the reasons I did. Do it just because you can. Well, if that will not get you thinking about life from a totally different way, I don't know what will. It's challenging. I realize, as someone who grew up in the church, it is really hard for me to start to accept the value of statements like this. I had the alarm bells ringing in my head. I said, that can't possibly be right. There has to be some corrective to this. But this is the beauty of Scripture. It is multivocal. We get different perspectives and different angles, and we can't ignore these just because they make us uncomfortable, and we can't go, oh, well, there's a chance of someone sinning if they go too far, so we shouldn't tell them any of this. No, it's in the Bible. And if you believe that the Bible should be preached as the whole counsel of God, then that means including the parts that go against your own sentiments. See, ignoring stuff like this for fear that someone is going to take it too far and sin just causes bigger problems, because eventually they're going to find these verses and they're going to say, why did you hide this from me? And then you're going to lose them altogether. Now, it's better to realize that the Bible is a far more nuanced and complex book than what many of us were led to believe by the average church sermon. There is a lot of just practical, daily, streetwise life wisdom in these chapters. And sometimes it's just fun. People see Ecclesiastes as such a downer book, and hopefully by now you realize it's not. But remember, we're getting to the end here, so he's circling back around and getting to his point after all of this. And it's actually pretty good. Like, yeah, he's still got stuff talking about death and how you can't control life and all that, but he's ending on a high note. He's telling you to enjoy what you have, and that's a really encouraging message. So this week, we've covered a lot. We have embrace uncertainty, expect the unexpected. Giving is like sowing seed, so do it liberally. Seize the day. Enjoy youth, and help others to enjoy their youth. Live with intentionality and purpose to get the most out of every opportunity. Say yes as much as you can, and balance risk and reward, but realize that everything is going to have a little bit of both, so just do something. That's Ecclesiastes 11. I hope you have enjoyed that journey as much as I have. Next week, though, is going to be a teensy bit different, because we are not getting into chapter 12 quite yet. We're not quite done with Ecclesiastes yet. That's going to be in a couple weeks here. Next week is our 50th episode, which means that we have been doing this for about a year now. We've actually just recently passed the 1 year mark since our first episode came out. So we're going to do a little bit of a year in review. We're going to have some Q&R, and we're also going to give you some sneak peeks into what we have coming ahead in the next months. So it's going to be really exciting. Hope you'll join us for that. And until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.